All right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. There may be people who join us midway through. I'm Al. I work for the Campaign for Southern Equality, and I'm very excited to join y'all on this grant writing webinar this evening with Alexis. If you have any questions at all, whether they are technical or just in general, you're welcome to use the chat function. You will be muted and your videos will be off for the duration of the webinar. At some points, Alexis may ask for responses to questions where I will unmute your audio. I'll give you a countdown to 10 before I do that, so nobody's surprised, just in case you're singing in the shower on a webinar, as one does. But first, I want to say thank you for coming and joining us this evening. What you're seeing right now on your screen is information on how to access the interpretation services via a phone. So if you have any questions about those, please let us know, give us a call, and we will help you as soon as we are able. Sorry, my phone is going. And I'm going to turn this over to Senzantle, our translation and interpretation team. If you have any questions for them, now would be a great time to ask or type them. Senzantle, Rocio, or Monse, do you have anything to add about how translation and interpretation will go tonight?
Nothing to add.
Great, thank you so much. All right, Alexis, are you ready to take this over?
I am, let's go for it.
Wonderful. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I'm gonna hop on the technical side of this, but I'll be here for the whole time and we'll pop back up in a few. Alexis, thank you for doing this with us and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Sure, thanks Al and thanks Senzantle. Let me get my screen shared with y'all and we will be ready to go. All right, hello everybody and thank you for joining us for Grant Writing for Southern Organizers. I'm very glad to have so many folks joining us today and I hope that you can learn a lot from our time together. I'd like to start by first introducing myself and talking about the overview of what we will be discussing today. So this is me, this is also me, but this picture is me. This picture captures how I feel about grant writing. Grant writing brings me a lot of joy. Working with Southern organizers brings me a lot of joy. And doing social justice work brings me a lot of joy. So I'm very happy to be sharing this time with everybody tonight. In terms of other things about me besides being joyful, my name is Alexis Stratton and I use they, them pronouns. I'm a freelance grant writer and nonprofit consultant, and I've worked with nonprofits in the South for more than 5 years. My email address is also available if you would like it. I'll also have my contact information available at the end of the webinar. In terms of my previous work, I have worked full-time as a grant writer for a community organizing group in New Orleans. I worked in community education at a rape crisis center in South Carolina. I worked in community education at a statewide LGBTQ organization. And I also worked in education at the Domestic Violence and Sexual Violence Agency that serves South Carolina. So I've had a lot of work on the ground and on the front lines, and I am very excited to be in a more capacity building support role as a freelance grant writer. And currently I've worked as a freelance grant writer for the last 3 years, mostly with LGBTQ organizations in the South. And I currently have a few grassroots clients that I'm working with. And I really enjoy the work because I am passionate about writing, I'm passionate about social justice, and I'm passionate about all the great work that's being done in the South right now. And I'm excited to see the clients and groups I work with grow and expand their work. So most people hate grant writing, and I am lucky because I love it. So I'm happy to share some of that joy and technical experience and expertise with you. In terms of today's work, we're going to start by talking about why grant funding matters and why it doesn't. And then we will go through some questions that you can ask yourself to decide if you're ready to apply or what kinds of grants you might be ready to apply for. Then we will discuss applying for your first grant, so what that process actually looks like. And then finally, I will give you some of my grant writing tips and tricks. I wanted to start by recognizing that my opinion is just one opinion, and one grant writer's opinion isn't everyone's opinion. So I know there's a lot of expertise in this webinar today, folks on the line who have a lot of experience. It is absolutely okay if you do things differently or if you disagree, but I'm just sharing kind of my experience and what has worked for some of the organizations that I have worked with. There will also be a lot of information coming at you in this webinar, because grant writing is really a very technical kind of area of expertise or technical skill. So there will be some kind of information passing, but there will also be opportunities for you to interact, to ask questions, and to participate. So I hope that there's a good balance for you, and that both the information and the participation is helpful to you. So after this webinar, you should be able to identify your organization's readiness to apply for grant funding, describe where and how to find grant opportunities in the LGBTQ South, and describe elements of the grant application process. If there's more information that you feel like you need after the webinar is over, you will have my contact information. You're welcome to contact me. Or also CSE is a really great resource for filling in some of the gaps, I think, about what we're talking about today. And because there will be some participation, I always like to include discussion guidelines in the different trainings that I do. This is a reduced version, but I think it's important nonetheless. So I encourage us all to respect the diverse experiences. Everyone is coming to this webinar with different backgrounds and different experiences, and it's important for us to recognize that diversity and to respect it. And I will do my best to do so as well. I encourage everyone to ask questions. We will have select moments throughout the webinar for questions and answers. You're also welcome to use the chat box. And again, if we don't answer your questions today, you're welcome to email me or call me. I'll give you my phone number at the end too. And then my third guideline is to assume that people always do the best they can. I think that's very difficult to do. I don't think you have to assume everybody in the world is doing the best they can, but I encourage you to assume that the people in this webinar are doing the best they can, bringing their best to the table, and I hope that we'll treat everyone as if they're bringing their best questions and worries and selves to the table. And I think that helps us navigate differences a little bit more easily. So I encourage that as well. So at this moment, I would love to hear from you, since you have already heard a lot from me. So Al is going to take us over to a survey that y'all will be able to do to share some information with us about where you are in your grant process. So Al.
Hi. All right. In a moment, you will see a screen, and there will be a few questions on the screen. Once this is up and running, if you go to pollev.org www.com/ALMURRAY 430. You will, excuse me, you will be able to access a survey. If it will come up for me. You can also text ALMURRAY 430 to 22333 in order to join. And so I love that you're already participating. And Alexis, if you'd like to read the question and some of the responses.
Yeah, sure. So thanks everyone who's already getting on board here. So the first question we have is, which best describes your experience with grants? A, I've never applied for a grant before. B, I've only applied for 1 or 2 small grants. C, I've applied for several small and medium grants and am ready to start applying for larger grants. And D, I've applied for and received grants of all sizes, and I'm always looking for new opportunities and ways to improve my grant writing. Again, which best describes your experience with grants? You have 4 different choices. A, I've never applied for a grant before. B, I've only applied for 1 or 2 small grants. C, I've applied for several small and medium grants and I'm ready to start applying for larger grants. Or D, I've applied for and received grants of all sizes and I'm always looking for new opportunities and ways to improve my grant writing. We'll give folks maybe another minute to either text to the number at the top of the page or respond online via the link provided. So far it looks like a lot of people have applied for 1 or 2 small grants, and some have applied for several grants, and some have also applied for, not applied for any grants.
And if anybody's having a hard time accessing this, feel free to type in the chat. Let me know. You can private chat me and I'll be happy to help you connect to the poll.
All right, I think that looks really great. There's a lot of you who have had some experience with 1 or 2 small grants, and that's exciting to know that you're moving on towards bigger and better things, I think. Let's try the next question. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to do that. So this will work in the exact same way. You can either text to the texty text described above or respond via the website. The question is, which aspect of grant writing do you find most challenging? A, finding grants. B, budgets and financial stuff. C, telling the story of our work. D, I don't even know where to start. Again, which aspect of grant writing do you find most challenging? A, finding grants. B, budgets and financial stuff. C, telling the story of our work. Or D, I don't even know where to start. All right, we'll give folks another 30 seconds or so to answer if you haven't yet. Again, let us know if you're having any technical problems. But it looks like we have a nice mix here. Some people maybe have a challenge to finding grants. I personally struggle with budgets and financial stuff, so I relate to my B people. 30% struggle with telling the story of our work, and 20% don't even know where to start. So we got a lot of folks at different places here, which I really appreciate. We'll talk about all of this stuff today. Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Al.
You got it, Alexis.
Okay, awesome. Back at me. All right. Let me share my screen with y'all again. All right, thank you for sharing that with me. It helps me understand where people are coming from and what kind of experience they have and what they're looking for in a talk like we're having today. So moving on from there, with that information in mind, we're going to discuss first why grants matter and why they don't. Because I think it's really important to go into grant writing with our eyes wide open. Grant writing can feel kind of mystifying and strange. Grant writing can feel very challenging. And for some people, especially if you haven't gotten a lot of grants, it seems like if only we could get these grants, then like everything would be fixed and better and we'd have all these things. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So we're going to take a minute. Al is going to unmute you in just a little bit, but I want to say what we're going to do first. I'd love to have a brief conversation and have a few people share via audio if they're comfortable. This question. So what are the pros and cons of grant funding? I want to split it up. We're going to do pros first and then cons. So Al's going to unmute you and we're going to talk about the pros of grant funding first. Why is it beneficial? Why is it good? Et cetera, et cetera. Why is it important? Okay, so what are the pros of grant funding? Al, I'm going to hand it over to you to do the technical work.
All right, great. Just so I don't catch anyone off guard, I'm going to unmute you in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds.
You're welcome to mute yourself if you don't want to talk. That is a possibility. But anyone want to share what the pros are of grant funding? Why is grant funding important? Why do you like it? Why is it important for nonprofits? What are the pros of grant funding? Anybody?
It helps with the progression of your dreams and goals of your projects or your nonprofit organization.
Yeah, absolutely. It might help you reach your goals as a nonprofit and your dreams and help you be able to do the work you need to do. Thank you for that. Anyone else? The pros of grant funding?
It's a way to possibly get a lot of funding in a short amount of time.
Right, it's possible to get a larger amount of funding in a short amount of time, maybe compared to other fundraising activities. Excellent. Anyone else? No? All right, what are the cons of grant funding? Why is grant funding terrible or frustrating or difficult?
I'll add it onto here. The challenging part on that for me is sort of the reporting and the closing the loop end, making sure that you actually gather the data that you wanted to gather to show that the money was well spent. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So the reporting can be difficult, evaluating is difficult, making sure you're tracking things, jumping through those hoops that a funder needs. Excellent. Any other cons of grant funding?
It's not a guarantee. Like you can't sustain your organization on grant funding alone because you don't necessarily know whether you're going to get it or not.
Yeah, it's not guaranteed. Even if you are funded by someone, you might not get funded the next year. It might only be a short-term solution. So the sustainability of grant funding can sometimes be difficult.
I have one to add from somebody who was not able to access their microphone. A pro was that it helps provide resources that you'd like to give but can't directly from your organization, like travel stipends or scholarships. And a con is that it creates an obligation between your organization and the granting org, which is a power imbalance.
Absolutely. And that power imbalance is something we'll talk about in a minute. Awesome. So those are wonderful. Thank you everyone for sharing those with me. I think Al is probably going to mute you again, but we're going to come back to this. And again, if you have more questions, thoughts, feel free to share it in the chat box with us. So I also have a list of pros and cons about. Let me unmute myself. Thank you. Al unmuted me. Thanks for that. So grants make me really happy, and grants also make me really grumpy. And I write grants all the time, and I have a lot of feelings about them. So the first reason that grants make me grumpy is because they are part of the nonprofit industrial complex. Y'all have probably heard this term before, but to me, it makes me think of the ways in which nonprofits are still a part of the dominant ideas and ideologies of the United States. There are power imbalances. They tend to be run and dominated by white folks, by people who are wealthy, middle class, upper class, educated, often men, if not men, then a lot of straight cis white women, et cetera, et cetera. And so we see within the nonprofit space so many of the same problems in our culture and in corporate America being reproduced. Nonprofits aren't immune to that, and we also then see that in the funding space and run by or founded by people who are wealthy or have some kind of money to give, often by people who maybe don't reflect the communities that they're giving money to, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a power imbalance. There is some inequality sometimes. And there's, for me, this constant feeling that we're like chasing after these funds or jumping through these hoops to get these things when they don't really understand us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they make me very grumpy because of that. The second reason grants make me grumpy has a similar kind of background, but there are a lot of barriers to funding. There are a lot of people in the LGBTQ South that are doing amazing work, but because they don't have a 501c3 status, because they can't fulfill all the grant requirements, because they're small, because of any number of things, they have difficulty accessing this funding, and I think it's unfair. And I think it makes it difficult for people who are doing grassroots work to get the funds that they deserve for the work that they're doing. And grants also make me grumpy because a lot of funders are unaware of the needs and challenges of the LGBTQ South. There's a lot of national funders in big cities like New York City or California, et cetera, who are not necessarily aware of what it's like for us in the LGBTQ South. And so sometimes their requirements or what they're asking for or different things like that are just impossible for us or just aren't what we need for the work that we're doing. That's starting to change. There are more LGBTQ funders working in the South, but it's still an uphill battle. I work with a client in New York City, and I work with multiple clients in the LGBTQ South, and it's almost always easier for my New York City client to have access to funds, just for a lot of reasons. And so it's still really hard to do this work in the South and to get funding into the South. However, while grants make me grumpy, they also often make me happy for a lot of the reasons that y'all shared before. So grants make me happy because with grants, you can expand and sustain the work that is being done in the South and the important grassroots work that LGBTQ groups are doing. The funding can really be a launching pad for groups to do more work and make sure that their work lasts. Also, I really believe that LGBTQ organizers and leaders deserve to be paid. As a recent survey from CSE has shown, a lot of LGBTQ organizers and leaders are working like 3 jobs, and their activist is on top of already the 50 hours a week of other work. Do all the LGBTQ stuff for free. And that's not sustainable, it's not just, it's not fair. And when your organization can get grant funding, sometimes it is possible to actually pay your leaders and your workers. And I think that LGBTQ activists deserve to be paid, and grants are one way to do that. In addition, I love that grant money is sometimes paired with technical support, leadership development, etc. I'm noticing more and more funders working in the South that are providing this extra support along with the grant money, and I think that's wonderful because a lot of smaller grassroots groups really need that kind of ecosystem of assistance beyond just money. And so sometimes when you apply for the money, you also get the bonus of this extra support or networking or things like that. And then finally, grants and grant makers can encourage really good things. Like sometimes they can encourage collaboration. A lot of grant funders like seeing collaborative work, and so sometimes groups that wouldn't normally work together might work together on a grant project. In addition, I have noticed more and more funders encouraging racial justice and racial equity work within organizations, encouraging organizations to reflect the groups, like encouraging the leadership of organizations to be reflective of the populations that the organization serves. And so in some ways that kind of external system can move organizations toward more just practices, to move them to making sure that they have an effective non-discrimination policy, move them towards making sure that half of their board is people of color or something like that. And so sometimes that external force is frustrating because it's not actually what you need, as we mentioned in the grumpy section, but sometimes that external force can encourage organizations to do better. And so there are times that I definitely appreciate that about grants. We're going to move into talking about the nuts and bolts of applying for grants and being ready to apply for grants, but I do want to address this question first. Do I have to apply for grant funding? I'm sure y'all know you don't, right? Some organizations maybe don't want to apply for grant funding. Some of them maybe only want small grants. Grants don't fix everything. Grants can be really difficult. Some people might just want to live off of grassroots fundraising. Some groups might be willing to remain a volunteer organization the whole course of their existence. And that's totally fine. So if you don't want to apply for grant funding, you're probably not on this call. But if you don't want to apply for grant funding, that's fine. But I want to give you some of the tools that might help you if you do decide to do that in the future. So before you apply, there are several questions that I encourage you to ask yourself and your organization. Number 1, am I ready to apply for a grant? This is obviously the most important question, and there are many elements that can determine whether you're ready to apply for a grant. And sometimes this isn't a simple question because it depends on what kind of grant you're applying for. Maybe you're ready to apply for a small grant, for a $500 grant or a $1,000 grant, but you're not ready to apply for $1 million CDC grant, a federal grant. So I think it's important to know that this exists on a spectrum and that you can decide accordingly based on what you might or might not fit with. It's also possible you're not yet ready to apply for a grant, and that's okay. Hopefully this can help you prepare for whatever that step might be for you next. The first thing that I encourage groups to consider to determine whether they're ready to apply for a grant is to know that there's a difference between small grants and larger grants, and there are different pools and different funders, and that that checklist of whether you should apply or whether you're ready might differ depending on who the funder is. So that's number one. But some things to think about to determine your readiness. I want you to think about your existing programs and your existing funding. A lot of funders like to see that you're doing the work, right? And it's frustrating because you might not have money yet to do the work, and they still want you to show that you're doing the work, right? But it's important that you're doing something, or you have a solid plan to do something, or you've met with these other leaders and decided to do this rally, or whatever it might be. You're going to be more competitive if you have done something or have a solid plan around something to do. The other thing to think about is your existing funding streams. What I have found is that if you are a good steward of the funding you receive, whether it's grassroots fundraising or grants, then a grantor, a funder, is more likely to fund you, right? So I always encourage organizations to start small, apply for small grants, show that you did a great job with that $500 or $1,000 grant, and then apply for a $5,000 grant, and then show you did a good job with that, and then apply for a $10,000 grant. That's not the only way to do it, but it does help show funders that you are a good steward of your money. I 1,000,000% recommend that, like, if you are a small organization with a $20,000 budget, please do not apply for a $1 million CDC grant, because you will probably not get it. And you probably also don't have the structures in place to appropriately track that kind of grant, a huge grant, to report on it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I recommend starting small and showing that you're fiscally responsible, showing that you can do the work, and then building on that. And also, it's important to consider your 501c3 status. You don't have to have a 501c3 status in order to apply for grants, but a lot of grants do either require that or a fiscal sponsor. I am not an expert on tax stuff like 501c3 status or fiscal sponsorship, but I know CSE has some resources on finding a fiscal sponsor. I will say, though, that some grants don't require either. So like CSE's Southern Equality Fund grants do not require that you have a 501c3 or a fiscal sponsor. There's a lot of reasons why people don't have 501c3. It's totally fine. Unfortunately, a lot of funders want that, or want another organization to act as kind of your like fiscal buddy. They sponsor you, which means that they sign your papers, right? And so then, and they're like the pass through for the money. And so if something goes wrong or whatever, then they're kind of on the hook for it. It's more complicated than we can get into in this this talk, but just making sure that you know where you are on that, and then how that might limit what you can apply for. And then finally, reporting and evaluation. This came up earlier. Make sure that you are prepared to track the work that you're doing, to report on the number of people involved, to do evaluations if necessary, like pre-tests and post-tests on training programs, different things like that, because most grants will require you to track how many people you're reaching, what you did, and to report on financial stuff. So how you spent the money, how you budgeted it, where it actually went, etc. So you have to have the capacity or the preparedness to be able to do that. All right, the second question to ask yourself before you apply for grants is, what types of grants should I apply for? This is a broad broad question. And again, the answers exist kind of on a spectrum, but usually if you're applying for your first or second or third grant, I recommend starting local and regional, starting small, and starting with project-based grants. So in terms of local, regional, when you're applying for funding that exists in the South, that exists in your state, that exists in your region, you'll just in general be more competitive, I think. And also those funders that are funding the South tend to have a better awareness of what's going on as opposed to those that are largely funding New York City or California, et cetera. It's also more possible that you can build relationships with those funders either through meetings or calls. They're often more accessible. So I recommend looking local and regional first. Sometimes in the LGBTQ South, that's hard. We don't have a lot of LGBTQ funders coming out of the South, but there is more and more funding coming to the South. So I recommend that first. Second, you'll want to look at small versus medium and large grants. Again, I always recommend starting small, but you might be at a space where you're ready for the medium or larger grants. So be considering what size of grant you want to apply for. Then you want to look at project-based versus general operating funds. Project-based grants are usually a little bit smaller, not always though, small can mean like $50,000, but they're limited to a particular project. So you're applying to fund this one project, that is what you're going to put all the money towards, et cetera, et cetera. And then general operating grants are less restricted. You can usually apply for them to fund anything in your organization. I love general operating grants. I think they're the best. And when you can apply for general operating grants, I usually say do it. So consider that. However, I also find when you're just starting out, sometimes it's easier to apply for project-based grants and you might be more competitive. It's not a blanket statement. It's not always the case, but oftentimes to get your foot in the door, it's easier to apply for a project, say I'm going to do this thing, succeed with this thing, and then build off of that to apply for other grants in the future. And then also you want to consider rapid response grants versus regular grants. Rapid response grants are usually smaller. They have a quick turnaround time. So oftentimes the decision will come within 2 weeks to a month. You'll get the check within a week or two after that. So it's easier to get access to that. Rapid response grants usually require some sense of urgency, some kind of rally response that you're having to something, some kind of immediate need, et cetera, et cetera. And then those are kind of in opposition to like regular grants, which are often grants that have an annual deadline, usually a little larger, fund a whole year of work, et cetera, et cetera. Regular grants are going to be more sustainable, but again, for early funding, sometimes the rapid response grants are the best way to go. But remember that they're small, there's again a sense of urgency that's required with them, et cetera. So I often recommend, if you don't have grant funding, looking at some of the rapid response stuff first and then moving towards regular grants. But rapid response funding is not sustainable. Like you can't fund everything using rapid response grants. So make sure that you're ready to kind of build on that in the future. In addition, this is really important, and I'm going to emphasize that through the rest of our talk today, but make sure you qualify. So grants and funders should be specific to your work. Like if you run an LGBTQ community center and you do direct services, do not apply for a community organizing grant if you don't do community organizing, right? If you if you're doing LGBTQ work, then don't apply for a funder that funds like reproductive justice work. If you're not doing reproductive justice work, you might be in your center, right? So just make sure that you're applying for funding that is specific to what you're doing. And also apply to fund work or projects that you're already doing or definitely planning to do. Please, please, please don't apply for, like, organizations often run into difficulty when they start chasing after funds. right? So, oh, this funder funds this kind of project. We should make that project to get that money. Please don't do that. That will cause a lot of problems in your future. It's better to apply for the funds, apply for funds for the work you're already doing, or are, like, as an organization, it's what you want to do. Don't go chasing after grants, please. All right, so enough of me talking at you. I would love to engage in an exercise together. I will have y'all write some things first and then share. So I would love for you to consider your grant writing vision. So on a piece of paper, on a phone or tablet, or if you're driving, then like in your head, I'd love for you to consider your answers to these questions, and if you can, write them down. I'll give you a few minutes to write them down, and then we'll discuss together. So question 1, what project or program do you want to fund? Briefly summarize the project. 2, who does this project serve? And 3, why is this project needed? So take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to just jot down, what project or program do you want to fund? Who does this project serve? And why is this project needed? So write your answers. We'll discuss together in just a couple minutes. All right, everybody. So I'm going to ask Al to unmute folks. If you're still writing, you can keep writing. But I would love to hear from you what your grant writing vision is, what your answer is to these questions.
All right, everybody, just so you're not caught off guard, I'm going to count down from 5 and unmute everybody. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, anyone want to be brave to share their grant writing vision?
Sure, I'll go first.
Thank you.
The program that I would like to write a grant to fund is our In Transition program, which is crisis response. It would serve the trans and gender nonconforming communities. I work for the Trans Empowerment Project, and we, In Transitions, provides emergency shelter, food, clothing, and financial assistance with HRT to those communities. And it's needed because folks in these communities generally are 3 times more likely to make less than $10,000 a year. They're more likely to have experienced homelessness. So we already have great success with it, but I would like to be able to help more people. I would love to get a grant for that.
That sounds awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. I love the detailed statistics too. That's really important in grant writing. Good. Anybody else? Your grant writing vision? All right, going once, going twice. Anybody? All right, that's okay. You can be shy. It's more important that you have this for yourself. So moving forward from this, I want you to keep this grant writing vision in mind as we move into talking about what the nuts and bolts of grant writing looks like. And for those of you who are more experienced with this, I'm sorry if any of this feels a little bit rudimentary or too beginner for you, but I think it's important to chat about all of this. So what does it look like when you're applying for your first or second or third grant? What steps do you need to take, etc.? I am going to go through the details about the steps for applying for a grant. I'm going to provide you this overview first, and then I will talk about each of these steps as we go forward. So number one, you must find a prospect. That means you must find a funder who you want to apply to. Prospect is a fancy word for a possible funder. Two, you must read the application information carefully. By application information, I mean like the funder information, often what's called a request for proposals or RFP, which is a big document that has all of the application requirements and things like that. And then three, very important, reread the application information. We'll talk about that in a second. Four, prep your application materials. And then five, submit on time. So I will go through each of these with you now. Number one, find a prospect. Again, prospect is a fancy word for a possible funder. Sometimes finding a prospect is hard. So I have some suggestions about where you can look first. So where should I look first to find a possible funder? The easy answer is search engines. You can just Google LGBTQ funders in the South, LGBTQ funders for homeless issues, racial justice funders if you're doing racial justice work, et cetera, et cetera. That does not always yield helpful stuff. Sometimes you find someone who funds LGBTQ work in California but doesn't fund the South, or you find someone who funds these things but they're not accepting applications right now. So it can be a little bit frustrating, but it is an option. The second place that I often look for prospects are lists that other organizations have put together. So CSE has a list of funders who do work in the South. When we complete this webinar, I'll send out the toolkit that they've developed, which has that list. You're welcome to look at that. Out in the South is a group of funders that reports on funding that's happening in the LGBTQ South and has a list of the main funders that work in the South. You can also use search engines like Foundation Center. However, Foundation Center costs money. So it's like it's an online program where you can search for foundations, look at what they fund, who they funded, etc. It's a really great resource, but it can be expensive. However, some public libraries have access to subscriptions to Foundation Center. So you can look on the Foundation Center website to see if there's a library near you where you could access that. It's an option. Another thing you can consider is who has funded similar organizations. So whether they're your friends or just organizations that you know in the South, you can see who has funded them by looking at those organizations' websites. Sometimes you can look at 990 tax forms to see where funding came from for an organization or who foundations gave money to, etc. So looking at who has funded organizations similar to yours can be helpful for finding funding sources. And then can an ally or a colleague introduce you? One of the important parts of grant writing work is building relationships. So sometimes it helps to have an ally or colleague who already knows a funder or that you met at a networking event or a conference, and see if they can introduce you, because by building that relationship, you're able to introduce your organization to the funder. And sometimes when that happens, then you send an application in and your application might rise more quickly to the top. It's a similar thing to when you're applying for a job. If you know the people who work at that company or organization, they know you and your work, then you might have a better opportunity if you're applying for a job there. In a similar way, it works in the grant world like that. So those are some options and opportunities for you. How should I keep track of my options? So you're not just looking for one prospect. When you're looking for prospects, you'll probably come up with like a whole list of places that you could apply. So you can track them. Please track them. Don't waste valuable research information. You can make your own Excel spreadsheets. In the toolkit we'll send out, the CSE grant writing toolkit, they have a sample spreadsheet that you can use. I also recommend some online grants management tools, because not only can you track possible prospects, you can track things once you apply, you can track the activities and outcomes that you said you're going to do for the grant, you can track your reporting requirements. One of my favorites is called Flux, F-L-U-X-X. For grant seekers, you can make a free account with them, and it has a lot of really useful tools for tracking your grant applications and your grants. I also have a client who uses Grant Hub, which has a few more bells and whistles. It's a little bit fancier. It is you do have to pay for a Grant Hub subscription, but they do also have a useful prospecting tool, a tool to look for prospects, where you can actually look up other organizations and see who has funded them based on their GuideStar and tax information. So that can be a useful tool for the prospecting part we talked about before. But if you're a smaller organization, just starting out with grant funding, an Excel spreadsheet should be enough to track, but please track as much information as you can about a given funder. And how do I know if we're a good match? Consider what the foundation funds. Do they match your priorities? Do they fund grassroots LGBTQ work? Do they fund grassroots community work, et cetera, et cetera? Do you qualify? Do you meet their qualifications in terms of 501c3 status? Do you meet their qualifications in terms of budget? Do you meet their qualifications in terms of region? Make sure that all of that stuff lines up. And who have they funded in the past? A lot of funders list who they funded on their website, so you can see if they funded groups like you. If they've only funded multi-million-dollar nonprofits in New York and Chicago and California, you can still apply, but it will probably be a more difficult possibility for you. So once you've found a few prospects, then I encourage you to choose one, obviously, and then go through the process with that particular funder. So when you've chosen a funder, read their application information very carefully. Again, the grant and the funder purpose, their goals, qualifications, the different application requirements, and then I think it's important to look at their keywords, priorities, etc., because then you can use those things in the narrative. Again, it's like when you apply for a job, you might use the same cover letter at 3 different places, but you're going to change it a little bit to match whoever you're applying for. And it's a similar thing with grants. You can use similar information from one application to another, but you'll want to craft it toward the particular funder you're applying to. One way I really like to do this, and I know it wastes paper, but I usually will print out the RFP, the request for proposals, and mark it up. I'll underline all the important things. I make notes in the margins. I highlight stuff. I mark the keywords and different things like that just to make sure I'm calling attention to either the requirements that they want, excuse me, or the keywords or priorities that they have. And then number 3, reread the application information. I have to admit, I have been that person who has started a grant application for an organization I was working for, or a client, and partway through I realized that I misread something in the RFP, or I missed this particular requirement or whatever, and had to go back and like change things and meet with the executive director and talk about how we had to shift what we were proposing, etc. It happens. It absolutely happens. But that's why I recommend rereading it a couple times, just to make sure you know all of the requirements, make sure that, I don't know, even things as simple as, is it a project grant or is it a general operating grant, and making sure you apply for the right one. So I think that that is like really important. One of the most important things about grant writing is to like read the application questions and information and like answer them directly. But the reading part and rereading is really important. And sometimes it feels like the characters in this GIF, like it can be confusing. You have to do it a lot, and sometimes you still don't understand it, but we have to try our best to get there. Once you have read and reread the application, you want to prep your application materials. The easier part of this is that once you start applying for grants, you'll probably find that a lot of them ask the same questions. I wish they all just ask the same questions and only the same questions, but most of them don't. They will always have something particular or a different way of asking it. But with the groups that I work with, I've found that once you already have a few grants for a few different projects or whatever, then you can reuse that in different places. And again, craft it to the particular foundation, but it's really reusable. So the typical parts of a grant application are listed here. I'm only going to briefly breeze through these in the coming slides. I think some of them are self-explanatory. You will also have access to these slides later. So I don't want to bore you by reading through all of them, but the typical parts of a grant application include a mission statement, your organizational history or overview, the populations you serve, the needs statement, the project proposal, the objectives or outcomes, and a number of attachments. Again, not all foundations ask for all of these things, but a lot of them do. So the mission statement and organization overview will obviously be your mission, your vision, when you were founded, your accomplishments, what you're about, all of those things. Your population served will be about who are your target populations, why is that important to you. Your needs statement is what's the problem you're trying to address. And for the needs statement, it's really important to be specific and use statistics or anecdotes where you can. Remember, a grant proposal is about telling the story of your work, telling the story of the community that you're serving, and sharing it in a way that's accessible to people who don't know you. So again, let me go back. The mission statement and the overview is like your handshake. You're saying hello, this is who we are, this is what we're about, this is what we do. And then the needs statement is the story of who you're trying to help and why you want to help them. And there are a number of resources for you about where you can get specific statistics, things like that. If you don't have statistics on your particular population, again, sometimes we don't have very detailed information about the LGBTQ South, then sometimes anecdotes work really well too. Members or something like that, or someone who uses your services, something they have said to you about their experience. Personalizing that can be really useful too. Then you usually have a section where you're doing the project proposal, or if it's a general operating grant where you're describing all the stuff that you do. And in that space, you'll describe your project or your work, the activities that you plan to do during this grant period. And again, that's really important that you're specific in telling your story, that you have a clear plan. like, it's important to remember that these funders don't know you. They don't know who you are, what you're doing. So you have to really be clear about the work that you're doing and why you're doing it and that sort of thing. Then you'll often be asked about objectives, outcomes, timeline. So like, what are you doing? What kind of change are you trying to make? What numbers are you gonna reach? How many people will you meet with outreach? How many people will you provide HIV testing for? How many people will you be educating? Or like, what kind of outcomes do you anticipate in terms of their health? What kind of outcomes do you anticipate from a pre-test, post-test, things like that? So what you hope to accomplish and the timeline for that. And then finally, most applications have an attachment section. Not everybody asks for this. The smaller the grant, the less stuff they often ask for. Sometimes you'll get like a $5,000, a million things, but usually the smaller the grant, the less things. But they will often ask for a budget, which includes organization budget and project budget. They'll often ask for a 501c3 letter or information about your fiscal sponsor. They'll often ask for 990 forms, audits, budget to actual financial information, etc. Again, not all of them ask for these things, but you will often find some of this in whatever you apply for. And this is a little bit self-explanatory, but this is my process. So once you kind of have in mind what you want to, like this information about your organization or what you're doing, I always copy the application questions from the RFP or from the online application. I put it in a Word or a Google Doc and I start working there. That's helpful because then when I need to copy and paste for future grants, it's really accessible. It also helps because some funders' websites are terrible and you can lose information, you can get kicked out of the online application form. So I just always recommend working in a Word or a Google Doc first and going from there. When you're answering the questions, this sounds very rudimentary, but always answer the questions directly, honestly, and clearly. I like to go through my Word document with the questions and like underline the important aspect of each question, like underline what they're really asking about, the thing that I have to answer, and make sure I start with that. That's all they want. They just want you to answer their questions exactly what they asked for. Not more, not less, like just answer the questions. And it sounds silly to really emphasize that, but I've worked with people who like don't answer the questions. And that's all they want. And make sure you're direct about it, make sure you're honest, don't exaggerate, be really clear and honest. So if they ask, what populations do you serve and why? Like, we serve XYZ populations, like blah, 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 blah. We serve these populations because blah, 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 blah. And that's often the easiest way to make sure you're answering exactly what they're asking about. Then you'll want to pull together any attachments that they might need. And of course, please, I recommend asking someone to proofread. I recommend this, one, because I feel like in some cases, anything can get you disqualified, right? I think funders really care about what you're doing and they care about that more than the trappings of the application. But it helps to have someone proofread and look at it. It also helps because when someone reads it, they might see like, oh, you're not really clearly explaining this, or I don't really understand what this project is doing or what the staff person is doing that you're talking about in the application. So having another pair of eyes on it is always helpful. Even as a professional grant writer and a professional copy editor, like I still ask other people to proofread my work. So I recommend that heartily. And then finally, Submit not on time, but early. Especially with online applications, it's easy to go right up to the deadline. I do it all the time, I admit it. But it's possible to run into technical difficulties. It's possible you might have a question you want to ask the funder, etc. So I recommend submitting a day early, at least a few hours early, just in case you run into any problems. So some funders will have online application forms, which I prefer. Some of those online application forms are terrible, but you have to deal with it. Some accept email applications, some accept mailed applications. Again, just make sure you're following the instructions of what they ask for. Again, in terms of following instructions, especially for mailed applications, sometimes they ask for like 4 copies of blah, 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 and not stapled, blah, blah. Make sure that you are following those instructions, whatever it is, no matter how much it seems like really strange to you, just do what they say. So I recommend just like rereading exactly what they're asking for the application process. All right, we're gonna have a minute to field some questions, and then I'm going to finish up with some grant writing tips, and there'll be a little more time for questions at the end. So Al is going to unmute you, so if you have questions so far, you're welcome to ask. You're also welcome to ask in the chat box if you don't want to use the microphone. So Al.
Awesome. Great job, Alexis. And you all have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Any questions so far?
Alexis, you did say that we would have access to all of the slides and everything after this week.
Yes, so we will be, we are currently recording this webinar, and so the recording should be posted, I think, within a week or so, week or two. I will also make sure y'all have access to the slides, so you can have that. I'll probably make a PDF of that for you. And then I will also send everyone on the webinar the CSE grant writing toolkit that CSE made last year that has some resources that line up with some of the stuff I'm talking about. So yes. Thanks for asking. Anyone else?
Alexis,
Sorry.
I have a question about any of the work that might be permitted to cross over into faith-based organizations. Does CSE do any work, or do you have any feedback about that? I'm a queer identified Lutheran pastor in the Nashville area, and we do a lot of work. I do a lot of critical care work around suicide prevention and education, and I find myself particularly engaging two independent groups of folks. The first is other faith leaders who are not part of our community, but who are really desiring the information so that they can kind of either make referrals, or they really just need to improve their toolbox. So education becomes key there. And then the other group that I find myself working with is parents. So but again, I'm a faith-based organization. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have as much knowledge about some of the requirements of the funding that CSE does, but I know through the SEF grant, they have their funding requirements are quite open. So definitely, if you haven't pursued funding through the Southern Equality Fund through CSE, I think that might be a good fit for you. There are plenty of funders that do fund faith-based work. And I'll say that there are Some LGBTQ funders that specifically fund faith-based work. One example I can give you is the Carpenter Foundation. And I know for a while, one of the big LGBTQ funders that's really hard to get, the Arcus Foundation, was specifically looking at funding work for the LGBTQ community within faith-based spaces or faith-based coalitions and things like that. So I do think that you're not necessarily limited completely, although there are some funders who don't necessarily fund faith-based stuff, but there are plenty of them that we've seen that do. And also Campaign for Southern Equality's executive director is an ordained minister. So there's just a lot of that work that's going on in the South, and a lot of, I think people are recognizing that like faith centers are still really important spaces for social services and for access to that for LGBTQ communities. And so I do think there is funding there for that. Some funds have restrictions about it, but I think that you would be able to find some of that.
This is a really great question and a really awesome answer, Alexis. I just also wanted to say that the Southern Equality Fund grant applications will be open again in January of 2020. So if that's something that y'all are interested in, you'll have access to those very soon. Also, Emily has just shared a link to where this webinar will be available. And any additional supplemental materials that Alexis has, like this slideshow, will be there too. So I think that was part of somebody's question earlier. And then, so you can find that link in the chat and also in a follow-up email. Also, it looks like somebody had a question, how much does it cost to hire a grant writer for a project?
Very good question. So thank you for asking that one. It depends. Some grant writers charge hourly rates. Some charge a project rate. Sometimes it's the organization that decides whether it's hourly or project. I will talk a little bit about at the very end of the webinar about the process of hiring a grant writer. But in short form, grant writer can typically cost between like 40 and 100 something an hour. I think for people who work with grassroots organizations, I tend to have a kind of sliding scale. And for grassroots groups, I charge lower, and for like giant mega nonprofits, I charge a little bit higher. But I think you can probably find a good quality grant writer serving the South that would be between 40 and 70 an hour. Usually for a small grant, it takes me 10 to 20 hours, depending on the size of the grant. And usually the more that I work for an organization, the quicker I am, because I have all the tools at my disposal, the things that I've already written for them. So, you know, you might be paying for a small grant, you might be paying 400, 500, 400, 700, whatever. Then it'll be even smaller. So, but usually for the kind of groups I work with in the South, 40 to 70, I see a lot, but a more experienced grant writer or grant writers working with bigger groups will have higher rates. So very good question. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions right now before we move into the final portion? Okay. I'm gonna, oh wait, I see one. Yes, question?
Just a quick follow-up to that one. When thinking about sort of hiring out sort of a freelance, does that also include like, here's the mechanisms to sort of track and X, Y, and Z, or, you know, yeah.
So that's a good question. When you're hiring a grant writer, does that also include grants management? Not necessarily. Some people strictly do grant writing and just do the front portion, and then rely on maybe your executive director or business administrator to do the grants management. Two of the clients I work for hire me to do the writing and the management, and the management in collaboration with the executive director. So it's really up to the grant writer and the organization what kind of relationship they want that to look like. But it is possible to hire that out freelance. And if you get big enough, you want to hire like your own like grants management person. But in the meantime, there can be some overlap there, but there's not always overlap.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions before we zoom through the rest? All right. Thanks everyone for those questions and for hanging in so far. I told you it'd be information heavy, so I apologize for how dry some of the grant writing things are. So moving forward steadily towards the end, I have one more exercise for you. I would love for you to take a moment and write down your next steps. So what's one step you can take to prepare yourself to either find a funder or write a proposal for the project you want to fund? And what tools or information do you still need to reach your grant writing goals? So again, I want you to write this for yourself, right? What's one next step you can take to prepare yourself to find a funder or write a proposal for the project you want to fund? And what tools or information do you still need to reach your grant writing goals? So I'm going to give you 1 minute to write that. If we have time at the end, folks are sticking around, we can talk about it. But I'm going to have you all do this for yourself, and then we're going to zoom through to the finish line. So please write down your next steps, and I'll give you a minute to do that. All right, I hope everyone had enough time to write a couple notes down in answer to these questions. Again, if we have time at the end, you'll be welcome to share that if you want, as well as maybe what, especially the tools or information that you might need moving forward. So as we finish up, I'd like to share a few tips and tricks that I've gathered along the way for these many years of grant writing and the work that I've done in the LGBTQ South. Some of this you've already heard before, so it's not going to be new. But number one, always answer the questions directly and clearly. I can't tell you how important that is. Someone asked some questions, sent some questions in advance and asked about how concise you need to be or how concise you don't need to be. I'd recommend concision, like being direct, being clear, answer only what they're asking for, and avoiding offering more. So read the questions very carefully, answer them directly, answer them like you would a high school essay prompt, where the beginning of your answer is an exact restatement of the question. And I think it's just really important to be very direct. Apply for the things you're already doing. Please apply for the things you're already doing. And that goes along with avoiding mission drift. So don't make programs just to apply for money. Don't start making 1 million programs to be able to apply for 1 million different funds. It's better to have fewer funds that you can apply for to really fund what you want to be doing. So just make sure that you're really focusing in on what you want and only applying for funding that's for that. If I could tell you nothing else in this webinar, I think I would emphasize that grant writing is storytelling. You already are doing the work, you have a vision, you know what you're about. Grant writing is a way of telling that story to other people to encourage them to give you money. So again, you have to make your story compelling, but you don't have to change what you're doing. You're just trying to tell the funder what you're doing in a way that makes sense, in a way that aligns with what they're asking about or what they're about, and showing how you match, showing how what you are about matches what they are about. So definitely use it as a space to tell your story, to offer your details, and to to paint a picture about what you're doing and why it's important. Build relationships with funders. So grant writing is only a part of the grant making process. Again, if you build relationships with funders, then you will know more what they're about and what they're looking for. They'll know what you're doing and know your story, and will possibly be more likely to fund you. So calls, meetings, things like that are always fine, unless the funder says they're not. Some websites, they'll say that they don't want calls, they don't want meetings. But in general, building those relationships is really important. And don't be afraid to engage in partnership and collaboration. Grant funding is a great way to encourage an organization to work with other organizations to do this important work in the South. So funders really like collaboration a lot. So I think it's good to dig into some of that. And then finally, just really quickly, before we get to final questions, these questions about hiring a grant writer. First, ask colleagues at other organizations who they use and who they would recommend. You can post a job listing. I got one of my favorite clients from a Facebook post that someone made. So don't be afraid to make a job listing for a freelance grant writer. You can also post on grant writing job boards and LinkedIn. Make sure you get a resume, writing sample, etc. And I recommend hiring the grant writer for a test run with a grant or 1 or 2 grants, and then both of you can see if you want to continue that relationship. You don't have to hire a grant writer. I will emphasize that. You can do it yourself, but sometimes hiring a grant writer can be useful. And remember, when you're judging the grant writer based on their skill or work, a lot of the times, I think the statistic I heard is like 1 out of 6 applications from a grassroots organization will be funded. So, and that's not the grant writer's fault, always. It's not always the grant writer's fault. The grant writer is just telling your story. So you have to make sure that whatever you're putting out there is really what the grantor is looking for. There could be a million reasons why a funder turns you down. It's not because the grant is written poorly or because you're not good. It can be baffling sometimes, but just know that it can be a long road at first to get those early grants, and just be strategic about who you're applying to have a better chance with that. All right, so I think that that is all of the information I'm going to throw at you, but I welcome any more questions. There were a few questions that were sent to me beforehand that I would be happy to answer as well. And for folks who need to head out, this is my contact information for folks who want it, but I'm happy to stick around, answer questions, and I'll answer the questions that came before. So Al, if you want to unmute folks, that would be awesome.
I'm on it. All right, folks, you will be unmuted in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Right, I'll come back to share my screen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can answer some of the questions that were sent to me in advance, and then any more questions will be welcome. So I had someone ask me, how can one assess how detailed a grant proposal should be? In general, is more content better, or is concision preferred? And as I mentioned earlier, more is not necessarily better. So funders are getting tons and tons of applications, and they just want to see the answers to their questions and to see how your story lines up with their story. So I think it's important to be relatively concise, to answer questions directly and exactly. But I do also encourage organizations to use details to tell their story. So the number of people they serve, the population demographics they serve, what your vision and mission are, how you became what you are. So remember that these funders don't necessarily know you or your work or your vision. So the challenge is to be able to tell your story in a way that is clear and thoughtful and concise. There's another question here. Let me check this out. Okay, so thanks for sharing this question. One grant we usually get is from a local LGBTQ community center, and they invite us to come to various events. These events often feel like we're being shown off and are kind of uncomfortable since the folks with the money are there with fancy snacks, all while we're scraping for money. How obligated should we feel to go to these events because we're getting money? Do we risk losing funds if we don't go, if it's not a requirement? That is a very good question, and that is part of the icky part of grant funding. There's definitely some of that sense of being shown off sometimes. Funders will ask sometimes for pictures or information about what you do to brag on you and to brag on the work they're doing by funding you. It might feel icky and frustrating, but I still recommend in general going to those kinds of things if you're invited as part of relationship building. You don't have to feel obligated, but I think it's just one of the not fun parts of this process. Fortunately, not all funders are like that, but it is one of the frustrating things. Again, a lot of funders really care about the work that's being done, so I think it's important to acknowledge that, but there does seem to sometimes be that gap. It's the same thing when you're trying to build up like major donors. That always makes me feel really uncomfortable. But I do recommend whatever you can do to build a relationship that feels ethical to you. Still, I would recommend engaging in that if you can. But
Can I just add one? Oh.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Can I just add one thing to that? I get this all the time, so I can definitely relate to the ickiness feeling. But one of the things that we do sort of internally is sort of the idea of like sharing the wealth. So having other sort of people in the org sort of go to some of these events, and then also having a sort of internal sort of thing, like, for the grant, like I will personally give, or our group will give them, 2 or 3 moments in a year to, like to show up and, but, internally sort of have sort of that limit with their, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So having internal limits about how much you want to engage with a particular funder or particular events, and then that sounds smart to like spread out who is bearing that burden in your organization as much as is fair and you see fit. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. All right, I have another question that was sent to me beforehand. What language should be used in a grant proposal, formal, casual, or somewhere in between? I think this is a very good question, and I think it varies depending on the funder. I typically use formal language, but more funders of grassroots organizations are recognizing that not everyone at grassroots organizations have the same writing background or education or experience or language style. So there's more flexibility, and I'm finding a lot of the groups that fund grassroots organizations are simply more interested in what you're doing and your story than the wrapping that you put around it. That's not the case for all funders. I do feel like some funders, like if you don't meet the requirements or you don't answer the question correctly or whatever, they'll like toss your application. But I think a lot of folks who are funding grassroots work in the South just really care about the work you're doing. Some organizations even allow video applications. There are more funders that are allowing Spanish, providing and responding to Spanish only applications and like Spanish and English applications, allowing both of those. So I feel it's more important to communicate the information you want to share than it is the formal versus informal. And it's more important that you're true to yourself and who you are and your experience, but you want whatever you're sharing to be clearly communicated and to tell like a clear story. When in doubt, err on the side of using formal language, but don't feel like you have to perform a certain kind of formality to get funding. And the last, nope, I lied. 2 more questions that I had in advance. Any specific terminology that organizations like to see? Another language question. I don't think there's specific terminology that you have to use. Again, I'll reemphasize responding directly to the application questions and the proposal's requirements. I recommend reading a foundation's mission statement, the fund goals, and so on, and using those words when talking about your work when it's applicable. And I will say though that these days I hear a lot of conversations about intersectional social justice work from funders, a lot about collaboration, a lot about integrating racial justice into LGBTQ justice, ensuring that leadership is reflective of the population you serve, making sure you're reaching the most vulnerable and most marginalized. And I don't think all the funders are totally there yet, but it's important that your work, I think, is intersectional. So you're working on social justice stuff and recognizing the ways that like LGBTQ justice is tied to racial justice, is tied to immigrant justice, is tied to gender justice, economic justice, and so on. So funders, I can't tell you the number of grassroots funders who have asked about how is your work doing intersectional social justice work, or how is your work addressing racial justice, etc. So I think that it encourages us toward being more intersectional, And I recommend that organizations take a hard look at the kind of work they're doing and how it can be more intersectional if they're applying for that kind of funding. And then the final question I had in advance, do you have any tips and tricks for making your grant proposal stand out from the bunch? Also a really good question. I don't. I just imagine all of the grant applications that these committees get, and they have to make really difficult decisions. And so, like, follow instructions, tell your story, like, tell why you're passionate about what you do and why your work matters, and make sure that it's a clear story, but also truthful and representative of who you are. And then provide details, because I run into a lot of, I've seen other proposals where there's just an assumption that the other person reading the proposal knows what you mean, but they don't. So that's why it's important to have someone else read it, because they can say, oh, well, it's not clear. I don't understand what you mean by this. So there's no magic method for making your grant proposal stand out, but you're already doing the good work. Grant writing is just about finding a way to tell your story in a way that makes sense to other people, and like that's what the magic is. So tell your story, be honest and clear about it, and don't give them extra fluff because they already read enough from all the proposals. Any final questions before we wrap up? I'm going to share my screen again and put my contact information up. Anything else, friends?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I work for an organization in South Florida, and a lot of the work that we do is we actually post bond to get people out of jail and immigration detention with a focus of LGBTQ people. Two of the grants that we applied for and got actually had interviews where we had to go in and pretty much talk about the work that we do. Do you have any tips? I know that all grants don't require you to do interviews, but do you have any tips for ones that do? And what ways will you go about doing that to get the best results, I guess?
It's a good question. I'm curious, how did you feel like your interviews went? What did you feel like was difficult in that process?
So both interviews was my first time interviewing for grants in general. And so I think it was more of the nervousness of me thinking like what I'm telling them won't make sense, especially because, you know, we're the only organization in Florida that does work around bailing people out. And so I think it's a fairly new conversation that's happening here in South Florida. So I was more concerned of like, am I going to make sense? Am I going to make sense to, in regards to what I'm talking about? And are they going to understand what we're talking about? But, I mean, it worked because we got both grants. So I was just curious.
Yeah, well, congrats on getting both grants. That's really big. I think, like I said, the stats aren't really in our favor necessarily. So that's awesome that you got both of those. I think, so sometimes you're right, sometimes grant proposals also come along with interviews or come along with site visits, which are particularly scary when a funder comes to your office and checks things out and you show them around and you have conversations. I think both of those are intimidating. What I usually recommend to my clients who have interviews or have site visits is to, like, one, review in detail the application you submitted to make sure you're talking about the right stuff with the funder. And two, like, I still will say that you want to be yourself and, like, tell your story. And I think, you know, as much as I struggle with the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that funding works, like, foundations are run, and funders are run by people too, right? And so your opportunity in that interview or that site visit is to have that one-on-one or one-on however many, like, personal connection, and really be able to connect with the funder and explain things that maybe like you didn't fully capture in your grant, or that you can't capture in your grant, like looking at the office or the space that you use or whatever. So I really encourage, I would encourage people who have interviews or site visits to be themselves, be familiar with the grant application, they want and are looking for, but then just use that time and space to keep telling your story and to be genuine and open. If it makes you more comfortable, you might make some notes beforehand, just about kind of like your talking points, what you want to focus on. But I think it's more important that you're genuine and genuinely sharing your story. Any other questions, friends? All right, if there is nothing more, then I'm going to hand it back over to Al.
All right, thanks, Alexis. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming and being with us this evening. All this information will be on the website soon, and will be shared with you via email if you RSVP'd. So check out that link that Emily shared in the chat. It is southernequality.org/grassroots-webinars-training-materials. And again, thank you so much, Alexis. We look forward to seeing you again. Oh yeah, one more?
One more thing.
Yeah.
I will be leading a grant writing boot camp in early 2020. People who have signed up for this webinar and have been a part of this webinar will be invited to apply. It's going to be like 2 months, once a week online kind of thing, where we work through the process of applying for your first or second, or the application should be coming out in December. You're more than welcome to be a part of that. And if you have questions about that, then you can let me know. But I look forward to working with, it's going to be a small cohort, only a few people. So sorry, guys. Please feel free to give us a try. Sorry.
It's time for something, Alexis.
Time for something.
Something's happening.
Feel free to keep your eye out for that application coming your way.
Great, thank you. All right, y'all. Unless anyone has anything else to add, thank you, Senzantle, our interpretation and translation team. Thanks again to all of you. Thank you, Alexis. This was fantastic content. We can't wait to have it up on the website. And we will stay in touch. Y'all have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night.